of you. Good morning, all of you. Can I have your attention, please? Sir, the side conversation. Thank you. Thank you. So great. Good morning. It's absolutely a pleasure to have you all with us today for the release of the Social Progress Index. But I must first and foremost thank Dr. Vivek Debroy, who's been a big supporter of the idea in terms of really doing an independent research, which was really looking at the idea of social progress. And of course, Pavanji, who's sitting on the side, uh, he's been very kind in terms of his support from logistical perspective, from say the data issues that we were facing and really getting the right set of things and so on and so forth. So thanks a lot. So special thanks to ESCPM for enabling this work for us and putting faith in us to really do this. But again, it's an independent body of work which has to be clearly understood and recognized. And having said that, if you really look at the whole idea of social progress index, what we are really looking at is that we are looking at three big pillars. And those three big pillars are basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. And again, if you really go deeper, the index is an index for all the states and 709 districts in the country. So the biggest thing about this work is that there has not been an index which really focuses across the board on social parameters or social development and really looking at those development of an index. We are looking at 89 indicators for assessing or looking at states, and we are looking at 49 indicators for looking at the districts. Again, India has more than 760 districts, but we have looked at 709 because we had absolutely robust data for 709 districts because we had to really bring in the very basic principle of really getting the right set of data and really pushing this forward. In terms of the next steps as we really look at it, this is the initial body of work, but we do anticipate that we are going to be looking at a longitudinal assessment as we go along. So year-on-year assessment has to be done because what matters is that how do we really change over a period of time. So if we are able to do that longitudinal work, that will be a very powerful experience. We have done something in a report in terms of looking at some base level indicators as to how things have changed. But over the next years, as we really progress, we would look at the change or the delta effects that are actually happening, because that's where the beauty of this work would actually come through as we go along. And there is also a very important thing that we have done around this is that we have created a tool wherein you're able to look at all the states and all the district scorecards. So if you really go to the PMEAC website, it'll be opened up at about 1 o'clock. You will be able to see that tool wherein you'll be able to see what is happening across districts. So for all 709 districts is what you will be able to see the tool for in all the states. So if you really look at this, I think that anybody who wants to understand districts and states, he can look at it as to what are the indicators saying, how are you really doing across your peers, is what we are really looking at here, doing here. But having said that, I think, again, I must thank everybody here. I would also like to thank Michael, who's my co-author, Michael Green, who's my co-author for this body of work. I think we couldn't have done it without him and my team as well. So we were close to 15 people who were working on this for the last 15 months to really get this going. So thanks to my team as well out here, who's been of great help. And I would also like to thank our partners like Social Progress Imperative, who's done that. We have the Social Progress Initiative in India, part of the institute itself, who's been able to do this. And I must also thank our funding partners who have funded our body of work, and that is MasterCard funded it. But again, to put it on record, they fund us as a body of work. They were not involved in this work at all. So it's an intellectual work that we have done independently. Thank you. But without further ado, can I request Michael to really come up and deliver his keynote. Michael, over to you. You have 30 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you, Ahmed. Dr. Debroy, honoured guests. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here with you today to share the findings of this report. Maybe the place to start is just to give you a bit of context about the Social Progress Index itself. I was slightly shocked to realise that next year it'll be the 10th anniversary of when we released our first ever Social Progress Index. This was a project that my organization, Social Progress Imperative, which is a US nonprofit, developed with Professor Michael Porter of Harvard Business School and Professor Scott Stern of MIT. And the idea was to create a comprehensive measure of the performance of societies in non-economic terms, because we really felt there was a need to rebalance the conversation. Economic growth has done a huge amount of benefit for the world, but it doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't tell us whether that growth is inclusive. It doesn't tell us whether that growth is sustainable. And so we thought that by measuring social progress, creating a social progress index, this is something that could be of practical benefit to decision makers. And that really was our focus. This was never started as an academic exercise. Our eye was always on, could we create something to help people who have to make difficult decisions, make better decisions? And that remains the aspiration of this project, just as much as that work we've done elsewhere in the world. And we're delighted that the Social Progress Index is being launched today here in India. Over the last 10 years, we've worked with a number of partners around the world. For more than 5 years, the European Commission has used the Social Progress Index as a tool for regional policy within the European Union, for what they call cohesion policy. They're using the Social Progress Index to shape the development policy of the European Union. Across major cities in the United States, from San Jose in California to Philadelphia on the East Coast, city leaders are using the Social Progress Index as a way of generating equitable and inclusive growth in their cities. And in my home country, in my home city of London, government leaders are using Social Progress Index to make sure that no one is left behind in their communities. So Social Progress Index is a tested practical tool that we really hope is one that's going to bring real benefit to the decision makers of India, to bring real benefit to the people of India. That's the aspiration of this report. This report is there to help create a real impact. And I must say the success of this report must be judged in terms of whether it achieves those aims of being a helpful contribution to supporting the inclusive development of India. So that's a bit of context on who we are, what we do. And so this report in particular brings this now to India, to 32 states and union territories, and also to 707 districts. So we've got a nice degree of granularity there, taking us down to the level of states and districts to really explore the pattern of social progress across India, to generate insight, I think, for government. Obviously, we're delighted the Economic Advisory Council of the Prime Minister is the customer for this report, and this is can be applied across national government, but also at state government, district government, but also a tool that can be very relevant for businesses, thinking about how they contribute to society, but also to NGOs and other non-profit actors, thinking about where they should focus and prioritize. So this report has got a lot of richness and depth on which I can only just scratch the surface in this short presentation. Let me introduce the Social Progress Index. The key thing about every Social Progress Index is it's built on this basic framework. And this framework we developed when we developed the first Social Progress Index. We looked at the academic literature, we looked at international agreements, and around this constructed this framework of what makes a good society. And what we said was a good society is one that meets the basic needs of survival of everyone, essentially food, water, shelter, safety. Secondly, a good society is one that gives everyone the foundations of well-being, basic education, access to information, health, and a good quality environment. And thirdly, a good society is one that gives everyone opportunity in terms of rights, freedoms, inclusiveness, and access to advanced knowledge. These 3 dimensions and 12 components are the basic building blocks of every social progress index that we build around the world. And this has actually proven very robust across different cultural contexts. So this provides a very sort of robust framework. We started this work before the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed, but obviously we knew what was coming. And we would say that there's a very close conceptual mapping between the Social Progress Index and the Sustainable Development Goals. So it means that the Social Progress Index can work as a reasonable approximation of how we're doing against the SDGs as well. So that's the basic framework for the Social Progress Index. The next thing we have to do is find a way of measuring it. And one of the big decisions we made when we designed the Social Progress Index was that there would be no primary data collection. Because if we had to do primary data collection, it would make it unreasonably expensive. The approach we took was actually there's lots of data out there. What we want to do is find a way of organizing and structuring it so it's useful to people. So in that sense, the Social Progress Index isn't a data initiative. It's more like a grammar initiative. We're taking the data that's out there and finding a way of structuring it so it can become meaningful messages for decision makers. That's what we're trying to do. How do we do it? Well, we start off with selecting a set of indicators. So indicators have to have a wide geographical coverage. We can't take one indicator for this region, different indicator for this region. We've got to find indicators that cover evenly across the territory we want to cover. So, for example, across the 707 districts. Secondly, we have to have indicators that are measures of outcomes. One of the big design decisions we made with the Social Progress Index is we wanted it to be as policy neutral as possible. We're measuring outcomes, not inputs. We don't want to measure how much a country or a state spends on education. We want to measure the education outcomes. We don't want to measure whether you pass laws against discrimination. We want to measure whether people experience discrimination. I think that way that takes us away from a whole set of complex policy and political debates and into the concrete story of measuring outcomes. It also means that unlike some other indices, if you can't really game the Social Progress Index, the only way to game the Social Progress Index is to improve the outcomes. And that's what we want in the first place. We obviously want to have data that comes from trusted, high quality sources. We don't want to take data that's unreliable or where we don't have credibility and trust in it. And indeed, for this work, we've relied exclusively on government indicators. But we'd always look for high quality indicators. And finally, they've always got to be related to social environmental issues. So that's what we do. We go out and we say what data is out there that meets these criteria. We also want data that's relatively recent as well, ideally with some time series behind it. And once we've sifted through these possible indicators, then it takes us to the phase of calculating the index. So the calculation, in a sense, starts by capturing these data sets from different places, then pulling them together, and then doing some work on the data to address problems like there may be missing values. So what do you do? How do you statistically impute some of those missing values? We've got data that's measuring very different things. It could be measuring, rates of violence against school achievements, against prevalence of diabetes. So you've got to normalize that data. You've got to take those apples and oranges and cauliflowers and put them onto a consistent basis where they can be measured against each other. This is this data transformation and standardization process. And then thirdly, what you've got to do is make sure the model fits together conceptually in the right way and statistically. So this is addressing things around unidimensionality. So are we sure that the indicators we have for each component of the model are measuring the same underlying concept? You don't want indicators that are actually measuring different concepts. And you have statistical tests for that. You want to test to make sure that indicators aren't redundant or moving in opposite directions. So the set of tests that we go through to then make sure we've got a robust index and we can compute reliable scores. I mean, I always want to stress, any fool can build an index, but building a robust index is hard work and there is a set of practice around that. We're very proud of the fact that Social Progress Imperative has worked with some of the leading experts in this field, particularly the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, the world leading experts. They've audited our methodologies. They've given us very high marks. We've also, since we started this project, had full transparency about the methodology of how we build social progress indices. And I'm delighted to say that in the report you have today, you will find full transparency on the methodology for this index. And that's so important, that transparency has allowed us to then receive feedback from people to test and make sure that this is a robust a product as possible. And I want to say very clearly at this stage is we love feedback. Feedback will make this product stronger. We know it's not perfect. I am sure it can be made better. It will be made better by feedback from people like you. We think it's a good, strong product, but it can be always be made better, and having that openness to feedback is a critical part of this process. So you'll find all the details of the methodology and the data in the report, and we welcome feedback, and there's contact details for our expert team within the report itself. So that's sort of the prelude. Let me just quickly show you, this is no time to go into detail, is the full set of indicators. As Amit said, we finally chose 89 indicators for our state level index. I do not intend to or expect to go through each of these indicators now, probably too small to read. Just as those are in the report. And again, what we've done is we've selected 89 indicators from all the available data that we think conceptually fits, meets data quality standards, and statistically fits together to make a robust measurement. So that's all the details of that are in the report itself. So for states, 89 indicators. Let me start first of all by sharing you what we found out at the state level. And I wanted to show you this map of the different states and union territories of India. And what we've done is we've broken this into 6 tiers. Now, the tiers of performance are based not on sort of, quintiles or whatever a quintile would be if you divided by 6. I don't even know, sextile or something. What we've done is use an approach we've applied elsewhere in the world, where we look for clusters within the data. So we're looking for, within the data, a feature of what are the 6 groups we see within the data to break this up into 6 tiers. So I'm going to talk you through the results for the states through these tiers. Starting first of all with the top tier, which is Puducherry. I must say, and if anyone wants to cheer for their state, you're very welcome to at any point or whatever. So Puducherry, congratulations, is the top performing state on the India Social Progress Index, all the way through to Kerala. So these 9 states form a clear group of being at the highest level of social progress, the very high social progress states of India. Our second grouping then takes us through from Jammu and Kashmir at 10 to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands at 15. Just looking at this data, what was quite apparent to me is that many of these top performing states are quite small. And indeed, that's a pattern that we tend to see around the world when looking at countries or regions elsewhere. It seems to be easier to perform well when you're small, and it's hard to be big. So it's not surprising, I think, that we're seeing perhaps smaller states largely dominating these top 2 groups of very high and high social progress. Our third group is these upper middle social progress index states. Starting to see some bigger states. Also seeing where we are now, Delhi in this grouping, from Uttarakhand to Manipur. These are the upper middle social progress states. And then we get into some of the big ones into tier 4 under lower middle social progress. So from Haryana, Gujarat, all the way through to Maharashtra, Rajasthan. These big states are very much dominating the sort of tier 4 of lower middle social progress. So this is probably a reasonable average where the bulk of people in India are living. And then our lowest tiers, tier 5, much smaller tiers. Tier 5, this is the low social progress, Uttar Pradesh, Odisha, and Madhya Pradesh. And then very low social progress, the very 6th tier, Assam, Bihar, and Jharkhand, standouts particularly as being distinctly of the lowest level of social progress. So this is where we can look at this continuous scale. We'll break it up into different groups according to different states. Now, another way we can look at this data is to actually look at how the social progress fits together with economic development. And this is something we've done lots of places in the world, is we've plotted social progress on the vertical axis, and then we've got state GDP on the horizontal axis. And this curve is something we've observed very widely. And essentially what it's telling us is that, yes, economic development is associated with higher levels of social progress. Getting more economic development is a good way of getting social progress as a broad policy goal. And that makes sense. If you have economic growth, you have money to spend on roads and hospitals and schools and all that good stuff that makes social progress. That makes sense. But what we also see is that around this trend line, there's plenty of noise. Essentially, there are GDP is not destiny. If you're devising the development of your country, your state, your district, based only around maximizing economic development, you may be missing something. You know, there's a missing factor. So if you want inclusive growth, then you've got to be thinking about economic and social development alongside. And we can see very clearly that some states are doing a better job than others at turning their economic resources into social progress. Just to highlight that here, I just thought it'd be interesting to note, our top performing state, Puducherry, is not anywhere near the richest. It's actually very middling level of economic development, but it's doing much better than its GDP peers in terms of social progress. And then just for fun, I thought let's pick out Delhi. I don't want to pick on Delhi. It's actually a trend we see around the world. Capital cities, capital regions tend to have this story. Capital cities, capital regions attract a lot of economic activity that turbocharge the GDP figures, but actually social progress isn't always that much further ahead. It's true of London, it's true of Brussels, it's true of many cities around the world. But it is fascinating that there you have Delhi and Manipur at the same level of social progress with such an extraordinary differential in levels of per capita income. So it really shows us that if our economic figures alone are only telling us part of the story, and that by focusing on social progress, we can get to understand which types of economic development are delivering for people and which ones are not so effective. So that's the state level results. Now, I am not planning to take you through 707 different districts. But actually, before I do that, let me just quickly show you a bit more granular data on the states. So for each of the states, we have what we call a social progress scorecard. And don't be scared when you see it. It's a bit daunting when you first see it, especially for people like me who are a bit colorblind. But what we've done for each state is we've said, how do you compare to other states with similar levels of income? So we benchmark each state against 15 peer states of similar levels of gross domestic state product per capita. So it's a bit like boxing. We're saying we're comparing economic heavyweights with economic heavyweights, economic lightweights with economic lightweights. And then we say, are you statistically significantly performing the median of that group or not? And so here we are for Puducherry, perhaps unsurprisingly, at the very top there, you see the big green light. So Puducherry, because it's a state that's on pretty modest income, is delivering a high level of social progress. That's overperforming and has a green mark. But when you dig into it, you see that, of course, it's not the case that Puducherry is brilliant on everything. It does have some areas of strength on shelter, on personal freedom and choice, on access to advanced education. But in other areas, it's performing on the average. And very strikingly, in one area, health and wellness, it's actually underperforming. So I always want to emphasize that we don't just want to take the aggregate social progress index score alone. What this tool allows us to do is unpack it and understand the particular nature of each community, each state. And there, I've been just looking at what's going on in Puducherry under health and wellness. There seems to be a lot to do with diabetes and high blood pressure, which seems to be health issues are arising more from prosperity. So there's been some particular issues that Puducherry may be facing. Contrast that, then let's just look at the Delhi scorecard. And unsurprisingly, most of that is red and amber. A little bit of green. Personal freedom and choice actually is good in Delhi, better than the average. And of course, the group that Delhi is being compared to is a richer group than we were comparing Puducherry to, obviously, because that's the way this tool works. But we see the different areas in which Delhi is underperforming. And finally, just quickly look at Manipur. So Manipur, it's doing as well as Delhi. It's a lot poorer, but actually it's not statistically significantly outperforming its peers. It's got an amber light rather than the green light. But again, we do see there are areas where Manipur is showing strength: nutrition and basic medical care, personal safety, access to information, access to basic knowledge, personal freedom and choice, and access to advanced education. So some areas of strength, but also again, another state suffering from particular weaknesses around health and wellness. So we have scorecards like this available for each of the 36 states and union territories to give you that diagnostic of what's driving those scores, what's driving those results. Now, let me take us on to have a look at the districts. As Amit said, with the district, sorry, I'm getting confused by two things. I can't see the screen. Sorry about that. Let me just quickly take you back then, just quickly show, since I was misleading you. So here is the Delhi scorecard I was just talking about. So you see with Delhi, a lot of red. There is a green there for personal freedom and choice, but otherwise broadly red overall, as you'd expect for a state with high income, but only modest social progress. And then here is Manipur. And as I was saying, Manipur is on average performing about within the expected range of a state of that income, but it does have some significant areas of strength, but also notably an weakness as well. So those are the scorecards available for all of the states. Now, so for the districts, we've got, as Amit said, 49 indicators. So to get data coverage for 707 districts, we couldn't replicate the 89 indicators from the state level index, but with 49 indicators, that's more than enough to give us a robust measure at district level. So these are the 49 indicators we've used. And as I said, I'm not going to talk you through all 707 districts, but what we find is that there's a number of top performing districts with some actually quite high scores, concentrated largely in states that are already doing quite well. So these are largely coming from states that are doing pretty well. And if we look at the other way, we can look at the states that are the bottom 10 performers. On the whole, these lowest 10 performing districts are coming from states that are performing in the lowest tiers as well. So that's the broad pattern that we see across the sort of best and worst performing districts. We don't have GDP or equivalent data for the districts, so we can't show you the relationship between districts and economic activity. What I thought I might show you, however, is looking at some of the intrastate differences. So here is Maharashtra. And I think what's really fascinating about this state is the fact you've got all 6 tiers within one state. Yeah? So you've got this within one state, this enormous diversity of scores for the different districts. And indeed, I mean, it's, one of the things we talk about with policymakers is that trying to equalize economic activity across a geography is in some sense always going to be an impossible task. Some places will be because of their physical geography, their human geography. There will always be inequality in economic activity. However, equalizing social progress across the territory is actually a meaningful policy goal, delivering equally for all citizens. So the diversity of scores here is quite striking. And we see this for a number of states. And again, a useful analysis that's in the report is looking at which states are better than others at equalizing levels of social progress across their territories. Now, as I said, we don't have the economic data, so we can't generate scorecards for the districts. But we have a different way of generating scorecards for districts, which is by using how they compare against other districts within their state. So here, for example, is a scorecard for Pune within Maharashtra. And so this scorecard, again, the traffic lights are still there. But in this case, we're saying, how does Pune compare to other districts within the state? Is it statistically significantly better than the median, or on the median, around the median, or worse? And here we find that here's Pune, it's a high-performing district, and therefore it's significantly outperforming other districts within the state. There's another district that we can also look at with a very similar score, Ratnagiri, and that's got a very similar level of social progress, very similar scorecard. I just sort of brought these two up for comparison because we do have some data about district income here. And I think it's fair to say that Ratnagiri's district domestic product per capita is about 65% of Pune's. So with this limited data we have available, we can see even at this level, with district differences, it's not, social progress differences are not just explained by economic differences. No, economics is not destiny. Some districts are better than others at turning their economic resources into social progress outcomes. So you have 707 district scorecards to enjoy in the report. Lots of detail there to go into and to work through. Obviously, if we're talking about districts, that makes us think about aspirational districts. And this is where this tool itself can very practically apply itself to the aspirational districts. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we find a very small number of aspirational districts within the highest levels of social progress in this report. I mean, perhaps understandably, because they are aspirational. And that we were looking to see that the trajectory of these districts over the coming years. And as we were saying, as Amit said in the opening remarks, I think the power of this tool, as it's developed year on year, and we build the time series, will really help to understand not just the static picture of where a state or a district is now, but also the trajectory it's on. And I think will give a lot of power to this analysis. And looking forward, I mean, I think it'll be especially exciting if we look at two states that have got very low levels of social progress, Jharkhand and Bihar, two states that have got a lot of low social progress districts, two states that have got a lot of aspirational districts within them. Really seeing how these districts developed over the coming years is going to be a really important and exciting challenge to see how those can develop. Because, you know, what the Social Progress Index can do is it can give you a diagnostic. It can tell you something about where you're at, a consensus around that. I mean, my background, I used to work in the British government, and I know that government is hard. Government is hard because it's about making choices. And making choices is difficult when you have different stakeholders using different languages about what they're trying to achieve. The education lobby will lobby for education, the health lobby will lobby for health, the rights lobby will lobby for rights. How do you pull this all together into a decision-making framework to understand your challenges in a collective way? How do you have that conversation between government, business, and civil society? So we really see that Social Progress Index can offer a way of creating that common language across government, but also between government and civil society. It's also a way of creating conversations between different tiers of government. We did some work, I said, with the European Commission, and we released a report where we greatly offended the governor of the region of Katowice in Poland. Because Katowice was one of the most successful economic regions in Poland, and we said that they had the lowest level of social progress. So I was summoned to meet the governor to explain myself. And we talked through the social progress scorecard for that region. It's a heavy industrial area. It has air, a bit like today's in Delhi. And unsurprisingly, it has a number of health-related and environmental issues. And I walked through this with the governor of Katowice and said, you know, the reason you've scored poorly is not because I don't like you. It's not because I've done my sums wrong. It's because you've got some real challenges you're facing that aren't solved just by economic development. And at the end of the conversation, she said, this is great. This shows me what my next level of development is. I've done the basics. I've created the jobs. I've built the bridges. This tells me what I need to do next. But this is also my advocacy tool to Warsaw and to Brussels to say that I need help too. So this is just the way I think that Social Progress Index can create that dialogue. What it can also do is unleash the power of benchmarking. And this is something Professor Porter is always very powerful about. He says about how in business, there's such a sophisticated benchmarking industry. If I want to make plastic bottles, I can find out who's the best in the business, how they do it, and how to copy it. We don't really have such strong institutions in public policy. And indeed, there's often talk about that we get prescriptions about development. We have what's known as getting to Denmark problem. People will tell you about what's the best in the world, but they won't necessarily tell you what's the most relevant solution for me. And this is what, again, I think the Social Progress Index can do. by benchmarking states and districts on their social progress performance and looking through states in terms of similar levels of economic development, similar levels of geography or demographics, can actually really help to understand who your peers are, who's performing better than you, and who's got ideas, lessons, policies, programs that can be copied and replicated. And that's a huge power, I think. So this is as where we're looking at this data. It's not just about where there are problems, it's about where are there solutions. Wherever you see a green dot on those scorecards, there's potentially a scalable solution that can be applied elsewhere. And that's what this data can do, the richness of this data can do for practical action as well as for policy insight. I started just talking about how the way the Social Progress Index was developed in the first case. And I just want to come back to this point, is that if this is a beautiful and substantial report with a huge amount of insight in it, a huge amount of data in it, but it does nothing if it stays within that document. It only means something if it's taken out to practical action. And our aspiration is that this is a report that contains a tool that can actually be practically useful to people. So I just want to finish again by saying we really welcome your feedback on the tool itself and also your ideas on how this can be applied towards practical action to deliver for the people of India. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for this powerful insight. But I think one thing comes out very strongly, that social development and economic development will effectively go hand in hand. And this is where I think we need to complement as to the kind of progress that India has seen over a period of time. Of course, there are tiers that we see, but the huge focus on social development in India is a very powerful thing that we are seeing right now, because that's how the quality of life or ease of living for people is actually going to be made better over a period of time. But at this point, could I request Dr. Debroy, Sanjeevji, Sonaldevi, Charanji to really release the report, please, and do the honors. Michael, here is yours.
I can show you.
I have my copy. Michael, you have to be here.
The paper's divisible.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Debroy. Thank you, Sanjeevji. Thank you, Professor Desai. Thank you, Singh. Thank you, Michael. So at this stage, we'll just move forward with the discussion on this report, and we'll just get into a panel discussion here. So, Sanjeev. So can I now, let's get into the panel discussion. So we are going to be really looking at insights from the experts here, or what are their observations on this body of work. So Sanjeev, could I request you to make your initial set of remarks as to how do you see the body of work? How do you think, as a measure beyond GDP, it could be an important thing to look at, how this can really work as an important aspect in terms of district as a fulcrum for development, and so on and so forth. Over to you, Sanjeev, please.
Is this audible? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you very much for an interesting report. I did go through it. Although I got it last night, I did spend some time going through it. Let me say that there is certainly some use of taking various kinds of social and other progress, normalizing it for GDP growth, so that in a sense you are comparing for peers in a sense. So no doubt about that. But I do want to add a health warning right here, which I think is an important one, that there is a very, very strong correlation between per capita income and all of these things. And by normalizing it for per capita income, by effect, effectively by normalizing for per capita income, you run the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in that you know, attention may then get diverted to activities that may not be so directly driven by about driving growth. If after all, as you mentioned yourself, policy making is about making trade-offs. If the trade-off is that you're going to improve dramatically in absolute terms all these indicators, irrespective of the peers, then I would argue you should go for growth and not bother with this at all. So I think you may want to add some analysis, or whether we should just not bother with this if the absolute benefit of sheer increase in per capita incomes overrides everything else. My sense is that to a significant extent that will be true. Two, I have some sympathy for certain kinds of these kinds of indices, which are based on somewhat objective things. For example, air quality. Fair enough, air quality. But I get reasonably suspicious of things when you get into corruption, personal rights, and things, freedom and choice, and so on. And let me explain this very clearly. I'm a macroeconomist. I usually deal with exchange rates, financial systems, stuff like that. So I'm not an expert in this kind of analysis, but I have, in the last few months, been delving into something that's new for me, which is all these various global indices that are popped up from Freedom House and VDEM and EIU and various other happiness index, and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things I discovered from this, the extent to which the methodologies are essentially rubbish. They're basically garbage. And so while I'm not commenting on yours because I haven't been able to get into the depths of the methodology, but I am naturally now suspicious of things like this. So let me give you just my loose thing here of some of these things that I found a little interesting. So, okay, there is one here on personal rights. You've got this for India as a whole. Personal rights, India's change between 2011 and 2022, so over an 11-year period. And this is one of the places where, in fact, it seems that we have actually deteriorated. Now, this seems rather odd for multiple reasons. This was a period, essentially, where, for example, homosexuality was effectively decriminalized in India. We got rid of triple talaq, and a whole bunch of other very progressive policies were put in place. This was, interestingly, also, since you're talking personal freedom and etc., this was a period where there was a significant decline in widespread local terrorism across the country. There were parts of the country, like, for example, the Northeast, that just a decade ago, there were large parts of it which were impossible because of all kinds of terrorist activities. It's now the most peaceful it's ever been in my lifetime, perhaps since independence. Just a decade ago, there was a huge red corridor of Maoist activities that has significantly come down. Now, surely all of this should pop up in these indices very dramatically, but they don't. As I said, I grew up in Delhi. When I was growing up here, Khalistani terrorist strikes were very common. It happened all the time. In the 90s, Bombay and these places would see trains blown up by jihadi groups every year almost. Almost every other year, you would have Sarojini Nagar or various things. Diwali Eve would have a terrorist strike. This did not happen for a full decade. Now, surely this impacts personal freedom and choices kinds of indicators, but it doesn't show up here. So I am just saying that I will hold my horses on these things because I have grown in recent times as a result of going into these extremely suspicious of these kinds of analysis. So guilty until proven, innocent as far as I'm concerned on many of these indices. So I would like much more depth in this. I could not find the explanations of them, but I did go through, which I thought were adequately fine to be able to convince me that the methodologies for these kinds of indicators are convincing. Having said that, you've got to start somewhere. So this is one place to start. So with the two caveats, one, I take a with pinch of salt anything that sort of normalizes away what seems to me the biggest driver of good things, which is growth. And two, I am always suspicious of anything which gets into these soft, fuzzy, subjective areas, which, as I said, it's not my area, but recently I've gotten into and was shocked with how poor quality the analysis in these kinds of things tends to be. Sorry to be a little bit negative, but I do want to be clear that of my suspicions of these kinds of things right up front.
So Sanjeev, as a remark, I think I just simply cannot disagree with you. That's where the thing is. And I think we have to look at all these aspects in terms of like how do we really look at the data that we are really talking about. So in this case, we have tried to not really try to do what you call look at questionnaire surveys and whatever. And I think the problem with the international indices has been that they're survey based. It can be very opinion based. So they're
based on surveys of 5 people, not even
exactly.
proper
So
surveys.
they're fairly useless, and I can't disagree with you.
So then, how do you do corruption index? I mean,
they're all wrong. So we are not even talking about it here. So we are not.
No,
even
you do have them here in there. There is an index on corruption. There is an index on personal choice and these kinds of things. They are there.
Yes, so the data is there, but we have tried to really look at the government data on that. We have not really tried to look at any international source on that data. So it is, if there is a government data, then we have used it. Otherwise, it is not part of it because we cannot endorse any of those international things, and we disagree with that. But I think you've made some very important points, and that is in terms of how do we improve it further, and we need to look at that. And I think we have to do that as we go to the next word. But just a follow-on question here: how do you think this tool could actually be used by, say, district administrators, if at all they would like to use it?
I think, first of all, the key thing is I would like some feel of what is the growth to this thing trade-off, if there is one. I think that would be a useful thing to know. If really the game is to go for growth, then let's go for growth. Number one. Number two, there are things where, and I think this is easier to do with environmental things because you can measure fairly objectively things like water quality, air quality, and so on. And I think in those areas, showing that there's best practice is useful, particularly if you can do it with countries outside of India as well. So this would actually be because, a certain level kind of air quality is good or bad anywhere in the world. It's not context specific. So if at say 5,000 per capita income, dollars, PPP, whatever, it is better in Vietnam, we don't need to know why. Is it because their climate just it rains there more and therefore it's better? What is it? So I think there would be very useful to us to get a sense of how this looks if you do an international comparison as well for these. As I said, for the social indicators, they tend to be more context specific and therefore somewhat more difficult to do that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sanjeev. We'll just move on here, Professor Desai. In fact, I know, I'm sure you must have seen the report. I did share it with you. But could you just share your point of view as to how do you really see this body of work? How do you think we can move forward with this? And how is it as an important measure, wherein if we drive towards beyond GDP as an idea?
So, this has been a very interesting exchange and sort of inspires me to think about something. Basically, I have never been a fan of rankings. And the reason I wasn't a fan of rankings is I think that when I was in class 5, I could never get myself beyond, 25th rank in a class. Okay. It was just very hard to go up anywhere above that. It took a while. Okay. And at some level, my parents decided to figure out what was going on that was sort of made my rank, so far below everybody else. Okay. They discovered two things. One was that I didn't understand, and my math scores were bad because I didn't understand fractions. Second, they discovered that I had no musical talent and the music marks were constantly pulling me down. Okay? They couldn't fix music. There is no natural talent. There is nothing anybody can do to fix that. But the fractions, they could. Okay, I actually got a lot of, my mother spent an awful lot of time, cutting up circles and squares and putting them together to teach me how to add up and subtract the fractions. Okay? To me, in some sense, this report has that kind of a value. Okay, the value is not so much whether the state is ranked fourth or 10th. It's rather for an administrator of a state or a district, okay, to look at which portion of that indicator they are doing well or they are doing badly compared to somebody else. Okay, and it's the diagnostic tool as a part of it that is very important and useful, rather than necessarily ranking against somebody else. I know we get into this ranking games, and yes, it's important. After all, that's a human nature. Perhaps if I were a political administrator, I would say, well, this is how I get my district magistrates to be excited about showing that their district is doing well. Okay? But regardless of whether people get into that rankings game or not, as a diagnostic tool, I can't imagine sort of a better useful compendium. There may be other indicators that you could bring in perhaps, but what you have here is an outstanding one. Now, I was just thinking that how else could we be using it? Okay? One of the things that I guess I am about to get into is my pet theory, which is that somehow we need to restructure our social safety nets and think about them very differently. Okay? Our social safety nets have historically sort of focused on individuals, whereas what's happening increasingly is what is happening to communities and to districts and to areas. Right? So COVID has particularly taught us that our fates are not individual fates. Our fates are allied to people who live around us. Right? So in understanding of what the area looks like, and perhaps if I were an administrator, I might want to know actually what's happening at a block level, but the district level is good enough to give you a sense of what matters and how you can address it. So think about it this way. When the COVID struck, we all decided that we have to have online education. Okay? Online education was the issue that we all focused on. And that was fine as far as Delhi is concerned. That Delhi probably has enough internet connections, it has enough electricity that you could actually provide online education. Realistically, even here, there have been a lot of challenges, but at least there was some hopes of providing it. Right? Now, if you are looking at Dang, okay, you may not be able to do it. Right? There, you may need to have a very different approach of how to provide education, what can be done, who can be involved to have sort of more hyper local delivery of educational materials. Okay? So, in some ways, I think that when we need to make rapid decisions, given some contingencies over which we don't have very easy control. Okay? I can imagine administrators trying to use these data. Okay? As an example, we did know during the COVID situation that people, diseases like diabetes increase health risks. If one were to think in terms of if an administrator started thinking about, okay, what kind of restrictions do we put in place and at what point we start sort of relaxing restrictions, I can again imagine being able to turn to something like this, okay, to be able to use specific indicators for use. Okay, so I guess what I am a fan of in this particular report is the way the indicators are provided, presented, are comparable across different areas and at a fairly granular level. What I do worry about is the indices, and I'm not always sure how they can be used and how useful they are likely to be. Particularly, I can very easily imagine, Jharkhand coming up to you and said, "Hey, we have made enormous progress, and how come we are not showing up on any of your rankings?" The second area that I sort of worry about is what you mentioned in terms of going forward, that we would like to build a longitudinal panel. For a lot of indicators of interest, the changes don't happen year to year. They happen decade to decade. Okay? So in that sense, perhaps having a longer time horizon would be a more useful one than a very compressed time horizon. And the final thing, actually, I want to really compliment you on the index construction. Again, like Mr. Sanyal, I'm also somewhat of a skeptic around indices, but of the indices, you've actually done an excellent job. Okay, anytime somebody presents me with an index which doesn't have reliability and validity calculations, I get worried about it. And I think you've done a very good job with that. So congratulations and thank you.
Oh, thank you, Professor Desai. Some very important points that you're actually saying in terms of how can we really look at granular data, how districts can improve. But just as a debate as we move forward, how do you think, what is the importance of measures beyond GDP? Because is it important to really look at measures beyond GDP or not? Or is it a futile debate? Uh,
And we are asking a sociologist, so I think that you are naturally going to get a very different response from an economist.
yeah, but the point of view.
But I do think that I actually think that a lot of these measures have tremendous value. Just as I gave an example, right? I can see that if the economic growth occurred, yes, it would perhaps everybody would have interest. Okay, but until your economic growth occurs, when you are hit with crisis like the pandemic and school closure, okay, at that point you don't have a time to think in terms of long-term economic growth. At that point, you do have to respond to whatever is in front of you. This is where a lot of these issues sort of come up. We also know, however, that economic growth does not address all the challenges. Right? After all, otherwise, Saudi Arabia would be very high up on a variety of indicators of social progress. So clearly, there are, and actually, there was an enormous research on health transitions in 1980s and 1990s, which actually found that there were some of the countries whose GDP was pretty low, but were doing really well on health indicators like Costa Rica, in those days Sri Lanka, and so on. So I'm not sure that there is a perfect correlation between social indicators and economic indicators also.
Very interesting. But I must share something very interesting. You did talk about COVID, and not part of this work, but I've just done a piece with Richard Dasher, who's at Stanford. So Richard and I looked at this body of work and the impact of COVID vaccination on India. And we looked at some economic numbers, and like that basic social infrastructure that we had and the way we were able to vaccinate. What we did find was that India added close to $8 billion per year to GDP or additional income because vaccination had happened. So that's a huge impact. So if you really look at it, there is some very powerful data that has actually come through and things. But let us move ahead, Dr. Singh, and could I request you to make your remarks in terms of like how do you really look at this body of work? How do we go beyond measures of GDP? How do you think India has moved ahead and things? Over to you, sir.
So first of all, Amit, I must thank you for getting me in and sending this report so I could read and reflect on it, and then inviting me to be on the panel. So I want to thank you for that. As far as I'm concerned, as a professor of economics and having taught macroeconomics at various places abroad and India, I would like to mention the doubts on GDP have long been coming up. Is GDP the only indicator that all the countries, all the statisticians, all the policymakers should depend on? Increasingly, amongst the professors and the students, there has been a feeling that GDP is garnering too much of focus and probably is not the right indicator. As you're aware, various other indicators, and there are about 23 of them, like the Human Development Indicators, the Happiness Index, have been discussed. Some have been accepted partially, some have been totally rejected. So your report is very timely. It brings in various things. It's reasonably balanced. It's an attempt, both the concept that you have brought in, and I like the chapter that you had is GDP related to my social indicators. Partly yes, partly no. And the graph which you showed, Professor Graham, at the end, which is not linear, but is curvilinear and shows there are outliers too. That's okay. The issue is conceptually, we do need something which goes beyond GDP, as our professor from sociology was mentioning. There has been, to a great extent, some discontent with a singular focus on GDP. As far as the components are concerned, and therein, I'm sure many of us have differences. I also have differences on basic human needs, foundation of well being and opportunity, things that you have listed. I also have differences on things that you've listed for the states and the districts. And I was wondering, how did you choose that? Means I would have, for example, like to have look at data of prevalence of diarrhea in the district and not at the states. But those are differences and that can always be discussed. And you would have your own compulsions of data. And I would say that conceptually it should be here or there and that can be discussed. But as far as GDP is concerned and the discontent with that is concerned, it is obvious that states and countries which have very high GDP sometimes have very different problems. Most of us have been educated in the US, and you know that in US almost every city has a ghetto, and there are problems with African American areas all the time. Professor, you are from London, and when I was doing my studies on financial inclusion, I was surprised. In 2008, when I did an extensive research, London was no exception. There were people in London who didn't have a bank account in 2008. So I couldn't believe this. And London has been a financial center of the world for 200 years. So obviously, then it seems that the sole focus that we had put on GDP for more than a century was sort of putting blinkers on us. And we in India are very familiar with the idea of blinkers. And you know, in the rest of the world, starting from New Zealand, they started with inflation targeting in 1989, and it was putting a blinker on the eyes of the policymaker. And then you know what happened. Series of things happened, including the global financial crisis, which they say probably was there because the blinkers were too tight on the eyes of the policymaker, and they forgot things like the non-performing assets, forgot things like the exchange rate and the balance sheet of banks, and that is where the global financial crisis happened. So therefore, the blinkers that GDP brought in need to be diluted. There's no doubt that GDP is related to social welfare. Obviously, the type of indicators that you have, if I'm doing well, I will allocate many more resources to social things. I'll open many more hospitals. But if I'm doing well as a state or as a district or as a country, because then I'm able to allocate resources to education and health, two important ingredients for growth, labor and capital. So therefore, these issues are bound to come up. Now, this study has been partially tested in San Francisco, London, and other places, and I'm not surprised because it does throw up comparative picture and makes it competitive from one state to the another. As Professor Desai was mentioning, I grew up in cantonment areas, and every year, twice, there used to be a competition whose garden is looking better and has better flowers, whose kitchen garden is doing better. And there used to be competitive environment in the cantonment, and everybody used to make sure that their garden is better. Similarly, in the states, if Jharkhand wakes up and says, look, what is happening to me? And how come Bihar, my close neighbor, is doing better? Or Punjab gets up and says, how's Haryana taking over? So I think these are very good, relatively comparative pictures that help us. As far as the focus on GDP is concerned, and I'm really happy to share with you, all these years we have been growing and galloping. But look, it was 2014 when the current Prime Minister woke up and said, look what is happening to financial inclusion. We are growing rapidly. The growth has gone from the Hindu rate of growth of 3% to now 7 to 8%. But why 50% of Indians still don't have a bank account? And the Prime Minister started a Jan Dhan Yojana, which has garnered more than 46 crore accounts. So therefore, singular focus on GDP in rest of the world, I give you an example of England as well as US, as well as India, really put blinkers. And therefore, we had to wake up. And then the Prime Minister started the Jan Dhan Yojana and all the financial inclusion story that you're mentioning. It's our good luck that India has been always talking about one planet, one earth, one family, and rest of the world never, just chased GDP, and nobody thought about carbon footprints, including you, Professor. In London, nobody talked about it. And now the world has been brought to a brink where everybody says 1.5 and all the glaciers will melt and cities will perish. And here is this country which said, look, beyond GDP, there is life. And that is where the Prime Minister spoke about one family, one planet. And in his recent speech, he says, I look at plants, animals, fishes, organisms in the water as one family. So I think your study is bringing in a concept where we have to grow and go beyond the singular, focused, blinker approach of only chasing GDP. Because we have only chased GDP, the world has been brought to this level where climate was totally ignored and now the crisis. You have asked for feedback. I'm sure you've got a few points as a feedback. I would like to add to that. One of it is, as you know, GDP gets revised very regularly. Every 10 years under the United Nations, you have the system of national accounts which get revised, huge books are published, but almost every year under the United Nations, these statistics are looked into. Probably you will have to also, 10 years is a long time. Professor Desai has mentioned about COVID and pre-COVID and post-COVID. I think your indicators are pre-COVID. They need to be relooked in the post-COVID scenario. Much has changed, much has happened. You have an indicator households having landline. Landline is something which I don't think this will distort your results. Well, who has a landline these days? Now, when you say total schools per lakh population, pre-COVID, this sounds very good. But post-COVID, we have done online teaching. And this is going to leapfrog us tremendously. Education, both at the university level as well as the school level. You have also to think about where these indices are placed and what's the quality of data. Can you compare, or should we need more granularity or more components or more categorization? Can air quality and early marriages sit in the same index? Right? They're two distinct things. Air quality is something which America is doing, and I can't help it. And early marriages is something which is so local to my culture. And you probably will have to, as Professor Desai was saying, these are changing early marriage norms. Starting from 18th century, the leading scholars and philosophers at that time have been trying to do away with early marriages. We have not been able to successfully do it. So these take decades and sometimes centuries. As far as your other components are concerned, I totally agree. Very difficult, and we have all raised our voice against the global hunger index. It's such a misnomer. And anything that comes from somewhere in the else in the world, I feel like challenging it. Global hunger index has distorted the food policy of the world, including India. And then you have things like corruption in it. Corruption is another indicator which has needs to be challenged. So I think in terms of opportunity, would I say violence against SC and ST, does it, should it come under opportunity? I think you will have to think through this. The last point I want to make is the quality of data. When an index like this is constructed and comes from a respectable institution with patronage of scholars from Harvard and Stanford and London, it gains automatic respectability. Now, when it gains automatic respectability, it covers and camouflages many lacunas and gaps. And these could be quality of data. You could be under the, as he was mentioning, probably garbage. There could be data inside it which is 10 years old and has no relevance today because the statistics which you probably have and some of the indicators while I was reading, I was wondering this must be survey based and surveys are not done every year and much would have changed. Similarly, some figures may be relevant for this state in Maharashtra, but may not be relevant for that state in Jharkhand. And that distinction needs to be made. It's a tall order, it's a difficult task, but I must congratulate the team and the scholars for extending the boundaries of knowledge. And that is how we extend knowledge and wisdom by trying, experimenting, faltering, failing, and then successfully going ahead. So thank you for this attempt. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I think very positive remarks because I look at it as to how we really improve it over a period of time. In terms of the data, we have tried to be as recent as possible. So we have data until about 2021 and all the governmental sources. So we've not tried to use data which is very old or whatever. So that's where we're coming from. But I think your point in terms of really looking at certain set of indicators is very well taken, and we need to look at that. I think as we've also said that we have to look at that longitudinal things to how changes have happened will need to be looked at. But just as a follow-on question, How do you think this can be used by, say, administrators across the country?
That's exactly the point I made by giving an illustration of a cantonment area, that you suddenly make the cantonment so clean and beautiful and colorful through flowers, and you have the kitchen garden and the front garden. That's exactly that needs to be replicated many times. I wonder how come you move, and I drive from army background and I've traveled across the country many, many times. How come you move from Haryana into another state and suddenly find it is so disorganized? And then you keep moving and you suddenly go into another state and you find it so beautifully organized. How do you do that? So people are the same, the television channels are the same, opinion makers are the same, the politicians are the same. How do you do that? So I think the way to do is, and I'm very happy you took it to the district level. And you know that we do not even have data at district level as far as fiscal is concerned. We have been struggling to get municipal data consolidated somewhere. We have not been successful. And so you have come out with a study. The district collectors can be assigned this task. These reports can be shared with them and said, okay, we could probably have a reward system in a single state in the country, which district is doing what on these 40 parameters, and make it competitive and invite them to come and defend. And you could also say, these are the best 5 districts in the state, these are the best 10 districts in the country, and these are the bad and the worst ones. So you sit in a competitive thing, you compel the municipal corporations, the district authorities to start doing things and improving. Why should one district not challenge their own district collector and say, how come I'm doing so bad, but my neighboring district is doing so well? Why should the MLAs not be questioned? So by bringing in such studies, you can compel the politicians, the opinion makers, office bearers to do something for their district. That, and I think these things need multifarious approach, multi-pronged strategy, and this I could be thinking in terms of using this as one of the strategies to compel, nudge, and tell them that they need to deliver as much as their neighboring state or neighboring district is doing. I think it has great use and utility, and you need to market it properly.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Michael, would you like to make a comment here on something?
I mean, thank you for this really rich discussion. Really enjoyed all these thoughts and remarks. I can't answer all of them, but maybe just two things I want to say. The first of all is, I think one of the problems that we have is the world does have too many rubbish indexes. And I think one of the reasons the world has a lot of rubbish indexes is because they're made for PR purposes. A lot of them are made by NGOs or by think tanks that want to grab some headlines to get publicity. And so sometimes it's hard work to punch through and say, we've actually done the hard work on this. So I think the comments about some of these indices are well taken, and I think I would endorse. But I think what we've tried to do is cut through that, because our focus has always been on decision makers rather than headlines. And there's no point in giving people a tool that isn't a really practical one. The second point related to that is I really want to always stress about this isn't a manual. This doesn't tell you what to do. This is the start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. This is something that can bring insight, to bring people together, to talk about what they want to do next. And actually, one thought I just felt was that, taking this on the road to the states and districts will be so important. Because I think our experience with Social Progress Index around the world is when the data meets the real people, that's when you get huge insight. And I think actually bringing these results to districts, talking to people, does this sound like your lives, is actually really powerful feedback, just as important as sort of statistical feedback and expert feedback. That's, I would say, a lot of other things. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Michael. Before I go to Dr. Debroy, I just wanted to make a comment and one quick question to the panelists. Just a comment, like as to what Dr. Singh was saying, there's something very important that has happened in the last 10 years in the country. One is, of course, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile, the JAM Trinity effort that has happened. And it has been a transformational effort from my point of view. We did look at some data from a longitudinal point of view, and what we have found is that the transformation has been absolutely stunning in the country, and which needs to be recognized very, very clearly. The second thing is that, as the Prime Minister says, that there has to be two things: ease of living and ease of doing business. And this is what actually does talk about, in some ways, to understand that ease of living. Maybe it's not the best index or whatever. There has to be much more concretization that needs to get in. We need to actually improve it over a period of time, look at the longitudinal data. But that's where it is. But as a last question, Sanjeev, the question to all the panelists, biggest takeaway and an action point. You have 30 seconds for biggest takeaway and an action point, please.
As those of you who know my work from before on, particularly on natural capital and trying to do green accounting and so on. So I am entirely sympathetic with the idea that GDP is an incomplete, I wouldn't say inaccurate, but an incomplete measure of progress. So yes, there is some scope for adding to it. I'm just that I have, however, become increasingly careful about what are the kinds of things you use, particularly when you get into these more fuzzy areas. And I'll give you an indication of what happens when you use one paint to brush things which are social indicator type things. I'll give it an example right from here. If you look in the indicator for Mizoram, for example, okay, now for inclusiveness, that you have these following indicators. One of them is enrollment of SC and ST, violence against SC, violence against ST, and so on. Now, seems at the face of it a reasonable way of measuring things. But the highest performing in all of this is Mizoram. Not surprisingly, it's almost 100% tribal population. So its enrollment of tribal population is, not surprisingly, very close to 100%. Is this a sign of great achievement? Maybe not, because that's the only people in those schools will be from tribal backgrounds. Similarly, the idea of violence against ST or SC may not be meaningful in such a state. Whereas a state which, like Himachal, which may not have a very large ST or SC population, I don't know, I'm just off the top of my head, but let's say you take a state like that, and it has a lower proportion, would you penalize such a population? I'm just pointing out to you, there are so many other kinds of normalizations you will have to do. In the end, the result may be more the result of your statistical manipulation than actual information. So, as I said, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that GDP is incomplete. I have myself made many efforts to try and complete it in various ways, but I am also very, very conscious of the fact that many of these kinds of, particularly once you get into the social area, the environmental ones are slightly easier to do, at least objectively, but the social ones, you get into all kinds of circular arguments and so on. And as I said, many of the results I'm popping up at me don't seem to pass my smell test. I'm being brutal here, but I want to be clear. There may be a case of going back and doing a bit of cleaning up of some of these anomalies, because not only has this case of Mizoram popped up, you've actually in the chapter on inclusion highlighted it specifically. So you've, far from pushing it aside, you have said this is a great achievement. How should Mizoram be? What else would you expect from the data from a place like Mizoram?
No, that's a point well taken. I think so. Professor Desai.
In 30 seconds. I think the most interesting part of the report is actually diversity between the districts. And I would encourage you to calculate your state ranks, not only on averages, but also with by heterogeneity and inequality within the states. Thank you.
Very, very interesting. Dr. Singh.
I think with any good attempt, the first efforts are always fuzzy, and that's exactly what is reflected. I would request you to consider two things. One is, don't mix the economic and sociological indicators in one place. Maybe you need to make a distinction. And secondly, there are some indicators on which you have solid data, and there are other indicators on which you have survey-based data, and there are problems, the virus of the survey that is entering your study, right? So probably you could make a distinction. And then when you go to the states and you go to the districts and want a competitive spiral to start, probably you should be able to say, here is a subset, here is the bigger story. But on this subset, can we compare the states together? So that will get you the minimum resistance and will be also useful for the country. I would conclude by simply saying that if you look as the economics profession, we have generally, and most of the good studies traditionally have been on political economy. It's not physics. At the end of the day, economics interacts a lot with the politics of the country and the sociology. We'll not be able to isolate ourselves from that. And there's no purpose. The whole study of macro is, after all, working with the people and the masses. So therefore, we'll not be able to isolate ourselves. We will have to weave in, factor sociological issues. And that is exactly where the Prime Minister, who's not an economist, has challenged the economists. And now the whole world is swinging thereby and said Jandan is a great example. And then the climate is another example. How the both have impacted economics and how economists have been chasing high GDP without wondering that 50% of the Indian population didn't have a bank account. So I think as a profession of economists, we have to live and survive in the political economy system. We will have to be sympathetic to these factors which policymakers, opinion makers, and governance needs to factor in going ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Deep. Thank you, Dr. Singh. So without further ado, can I now request Dr. Debroy to make his comments and remarks on this? Dr. Debroy, please.
Thank you, Amit, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. India is a large country, India is a diverse country, India is a heterogeneous country. The more work we have that helps us understand India in its diversity, in its heterogeneity, the better it is. So let me first congratulate the Institute for Competitiveness for having done this work, as Amit said at the beginning, for us. It is not work done by us, it is work done for us. So thank you, Amit, and particularly thanks to Michael Green for having taken the trouble to come all the way down from London to make his presentation and tell us about what this index is about. Some of you may know, particularly the older ones, that many years ago, a colleague, Lavish Bhandari, and I used to do an annual ranking of states for India called State of the States. Long time back, some 25 years back, it started in 1997, was discontinued after several years. India today still does it, but that's slightly different. In those days, doing rankings of states was more difficult because data were difficult to get. These days, particularly with data available electronically, government dashboards, everyone does a ranking. Almost every week, there seems to be a ranking of something or the other. And while this is being launched, India Today, the current issue, has done a ranking of another state of the states. Some of the issues that we confronted 25 years ago still remain as issues. And I want to flag some of those. Some of them have been flagged by the panelists, but I want to flag them again in slightly different sense. First question in doing any ranking: do I want to use data based on responses to questionnaires, perceptions? You haven't done it. It's excellent that you have not done it, because anything that is based on perceptions leaves a lot to be desired. So this is not based on perceptions. This is based on so-called objective data. Why are you doing this? One could argue you are doing this as an intellectual exercise, describing what is going on.
But in your statements, including Michael's statements, including what is in this report, you're not doing it only for that purpose. It is not a pure descriptive exercise. It is a normative or prescriptive exercise. Any normative or prescriptive exercise has value judgments. We've got these indicators. Why have we got these indicators? Because these are indicators for which we have data available. There are plenty of other indicators one could have thought of. They've not been included because data are available, and whatever data is available, we've included in these. But I have to be slightly careful. I've got a bunch of indicators around environmental quality. Do I actually have the data? I don't. Rubbish. I have air quality data for a town or a city. And now I am applying it for an entire state. That's intellectually not correct. So just because I want to rank environment, just because I think it's important, just because I want to include it, I cannot use it. Unless I'm doing a ranking for cities, which also Lavish and I used to do. As other panelists have said, several of the indicators here, they have value judgments. You may think that these are the right indicators to use, but they are value judgments. Let me take an example. And this is an example that was thrown back to me when we used to do the ranking then. And like you today, you have something which is, where is it? It's about availability of tap water. And of course, this is part of the government's mission now, but 25 years ago, there were people from Kerala and there were people from Meghalaya who told me, aren't you confused? Is the objective to give us water to the tap, or is the objective to give us clean drinking water? Make up your mind. Because if I'm getting clean drinking water through a well or through a stream, what is your problem? Now you may think that tap water is something that should automatically be included. But there's a value judgment there. And you've got it here. Charan has already mentioned landlines. Sanjeev has mentioned corruption. Corruption is a nice term to introduce because it looks particularly nice if you're making cross-country comparisons, which you are. But you're not measuring corruption. What you're measuring is conviction rates under the Prevention of Corruption Act. That's what you're measuring. So why call it corruption? If you're going to call it corruption, if you're going to have that, then why is that not part of access to judiciary? I look at your indicators on crimes against women. You've got your three pillars following Michael Porter's saying. You've got basic human needs, foundation of well-being, and opportunity. And I find crimes against women under basic human needs. And I find a subset of those crimes against women, kidnapping and abduction, under opportunity. Now, which is it? So there is this problem. Whenever I've got 3 heads, 4 heads, 5 heads, there is a problem of deciding whether an indicator belongs on X head, Y head, or Z head, or am I going to include it under all the heads? So several of these indicators, Sanjeev has mentioned SC/ST, but there are many other indicators which I think need thinking through. To provoke you a little bit, to provoke everyone a little bit, I'll pick on early marriages. Really? Is the problem early marriages or is the problem early delivery? Which one? Is it better not to have marriages and have early delivery outside marriage as in the US? Which one? Now you've included early marriages, assuming that it is almost axiomatic that this is something we need to clamp down upon. And I'm suggesting this to illustrate that there are value judgments in each of these. You may think they aren't, but there are. And therefore, all of these indicators need to be thought through, several of them. Once I've done that, there is the issue of normalization. Do I normalize by population? Unless it's a rate. Do I normalize by population? Do I normalize by geographical area? There is a question of weights. Partly you've got equal weights, partly you've got PCA. Now, the point I'm making is that indices are always very sensitive to the choice of weights and how I'm aggregating. And therefore, to reiterate what Dr. Desai said, the rankings one should be very skeptical about, especially if the differences between the indices is not much. Which is why I liked what you did in the presentation, which is the bunching together instead of the ranking. Of course, everyone loves ranking, not only in your school, everyone wants to know who was first, who was second. But the point is that in all of this, you will have a bunching of states in neat groups. So it's a moot question whether you want to report the rankings because it will grab the headlines, or you want to report the bunches. The next question that arises is, do I treat small states and large states equally, or do I not? Large states have larger geographical areas. You, of course, have small states and UTs and large states. When we used to do the ranking, our cutoff used to be population of 25 million and or a geographical area more than 25,000 square kilometers. But the point, of course, is that large states are more difficult. Larger states are also states where you have a large number of villages with population sizes of less than 500. I don't know what the last census figure is, but earlier it used to be about 45,000 villages. Now, delivering any of these foundations of well-being or basic human needs there is going to be much more difficult, as it's going to be in hilly terrain. Delivering tap water on plain ground is completely different from delivering it up a hill. So far as large states are concerned, there's a long-standing debate that goes on in India about sort of whether we should have smaller states. What is relevant for this purpose is you have got a cross-section at one point in time. And it is obvious that comparing the small states with the larger ones is not fair. Therefore, what is much more important is the increment over time. In doing that increment over time, of course, you have a problem. One problem is, which you have not faced, you will not face hopefully, we faced when UP was broken up, when Bihar, Jharkhand was split, and when Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh were divided. What do? You won't have that problem, but you're going to do districts. Now, districts are created all the time. So if you are going to do this continuously, then you have a real problem to grapple with, that how do you handle that? You made a passing comment on GST, on income actually. This is also a dicey issue because there is a difference between a state's GSDP and the state's income, which makes a significant difference if remittance income is important in that state. So before making any assertion, because you're not only using it for descriptive purposes, you're also making assertions. One of the things that is not here at all is land. Well, indirectly it is there. I could advance an argument, and I don't mean it completely in a flippant sense, that I forget all this And much of the deprivation in India is explained simply by the zamindari system. That every state which had a zamindari system performs relatively worse compared to the Mahalwari and even the Rayatwari. Now, one of the problems with this is land and labor. They should figure somewhere. Labor does, I guess, tangentially, because it has got things about education. By the way, on access to justice, also please be careful. Is fast justice necessarily a desirable thing? That's also a value judgment. But what's completely missing here is any measure of land, which I would say is a vital element of opportunity, because we kept talking about ST. Now, there are serious land issues there in terms of freedom of opportunity. So in conclusion, I think it's a very valuable exercise. Have you told us anything new? I guess not. You have told it to us a little bit differently. It would have been a bit more convincing had we not had reasons to find fault with the data. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Debroy. So this is, again, I think just to react to some of your points, I think we need to take your suggestions in mind, and as we really move forward, we need to actually improve it over a period of time. And there's a lot of insight that we get from the panel. We do look at improving as we go along. We want to look at the longitudinal data. We want to see the delta effect and really make it as an exercise which is fruitful and usable. Of course, like on issues of land or looking at the indicators and much more in depth, yes, needs to be done. We'll take care of it as we move along. But I think the real value for this work at this point in time lies in terms of like how districts can look at their performance in terms of like the scorecards, which is the real value of work. And I think this is where we have tried that we create tiers of districts, that there are bunches or clusters of districts or clusters of states in terms of understanding performance, rather than actually saying, oh, this is rank 1 or this is 500 or whatever. So that is where it is. It does tell us as to how that spatial differences are there and how it becomes an important measure to really move forward. But these are a few things. Michael, would you like to make any comment before we close?
No, just say thank you for the feedback. And I think there's so much that can be done. I mean, I think the very size and complexity of India, and I think we should think about this, Amit, with the data tools, is how can you actually pull together the measure of social progress with demographics, geography, all those different factors to deepen the understanding of that insight from the data. So lots of really fascinating feedback, lots of things I think we can work on, and it always gets better thanks to feedback. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think as we move forward, there is also this iterations that can be looked at specifically to certain, say, youth, as to how they really look at it, or how children can be looked at, or whatever. So we can create different ideas. But I think we need to really go deeper in terms of data. And I think Sanjeev has made some very important points which need to be looked at. Dr. Debroy has made some very important points that need to be looked at. And Dr. Singh, Dr. Desai. But I think this is where we will, anything else? So I would just request everybody to really look at the report, which is available online now. The tool is also available online, so you can go to the EAC website. It is available there. It is also available on the Institute for Competitiveness website. So would invite you to actually look at the tool, explore it, and see, and do give us your feedback in terms of how we can actually improve it over a period of time. But at this moment, I would like to thank EACPM once again for really allowing us to do this body of work and letting this see the light of the day. And I think it's been an honor to work on this. Thank you, Sanjeev. Thank you, Pavanji. Thank you, Dr. Debroy. Thanks to all the panelists for being here. And thank you, Michael, for being here. So this is where we'll call it a day. Thank you. And if you want to have any questions, you can ask now.
You did mention passively about women.
Thank you. We'll just close the program, please. Thank you.
Really the beginning. I didn't hear much about that. I haven't read the book, But I think it's a very important aspect, disaggregated data on gender. And if you have women, the districts are all now about that. What have you, how much have you taken in? It'll have a lot of impact.
Can I just request every one of you to join us for lunch? The lunch is served next to the auditorium, please. Thanks a lot. Do you want to answer?
What? Question is for you. Why should I answer?
Sanjeev.